I'm going to show how to make a wood texture using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. Wood is a classic procedural texture, and there are a lot of different ways to approach this. One of my first procedural texture videos was on wood, and I'm going to do an updated version of it where I explain it in a little more detail. In this video, I'm going to look at 3 different styles of wood. The first one is based on Perlin noise, then I'll do one based on oscillators, and then I'll finish with using some interpolation to blend between the Perlin noise wood and the oscillator wood. To get started, I'll start with a new document. I'll set it to XGA, then 1024 by 1024 pixels. Make sure it's an RGB8 and create that and fill it with black. Choose the Move tool and add a live procedural texture filter. I'll add a single equation and assign it to the 3 color channels. I'll add a single custom real number input A and call it scale. And I'll set that to 4. I'm going to need to rotate my coordinate system, so I'll also add an angle input. I'll label it TH for theta for my angle, and I'll label this angle. I'm going to need to stretch things out, so I'm also going to add a scaling factor, and I'll just call it SX. I'll call this stretch. That'll allow me to stretch my coordinate system in a given direction. I'm going to start with a variable, and I'll call it SV for scaling vector. This will be a 2-element vector, so vec2 of SX, and for Y I'm just going to put in 1. And I want to normalize this, so I'm going to put this inside of a normalize function. I'm going to put in a coordinate system variable v equals vec2, and I want to make this a rotatable coordinate system, so I'll have rx times cosine of theta minus ry times sine of theta, and then rx times sine of theta plus ry times cosine of theta. And then I want to multiply by a. I'm also going to multiply by my scaling vector SV and divide by w, which is the width of the document in pixels. Then I'm going to put in perlincubic. I'll use my coordinate system 10, so I'll have 10 octaves in this one. And then I'll put in another 0 to 1 input for the smoothing factor. So I need to add that 0 to 1. I'll label that. I'll give that the name S, and I'll call this smooth. So there's my Perlin noise, and then I can stretch it with this one, and I can rotate it with this one. Now I'm going to label this variable T1 equals perlincubic. Now I want to put this inside of an oscillator. So if I just use oscillator of T1, and I'm going to add a real input B, and this will be the number of grains in the wood. So this will be for the wood grain. I'm going to multiply B times T1. And so as I bring this up, I get more grains. Now, what I'd like to do is be sort of at a constant value, and then dip down to sort of a point when it goes down into the grain. Right now it's sort of pointed on both ends, so I don't want that. If I look at my oscillators, oscillator SQ goes up to a point and then down into it's rounded at the bottom. So that one is pretty good. This one would also be good, but I want the inverse of that. So I want oscillator SQi. So instead of just a regular oscillator, I'm going to change this to oscillator SQI. So that looks better, and it's starting to look a little bit more wood-like. You can add more grains, so you'd have lots of grains. You can stretch this out a little bit more, and then smooth it too, so you can have just a little bit of roughness to it. Now I'm going to add some color to this, and so I'm going to make this into another variable. I'll call it TF, so that'll be my final texture, but I'm going to add a vec3 for the color, and it'll be R1, G1, B1, so I'm going to put in some custom inputs for the colors. That'll be times TF, and I'm going to add on a vec3 with 3 other colors, R2, G2, and B2 times 1 minus TF. So now I've got to add my colors. I'll add 0 to 1 range inputs, 6 of them. This one will be R1, G1, B1, and R2, G2, and B2. And then I'll just label these as well. Red 1, green 1, blue 1, and red 2, green 2, and blue 2. Now I can start adjusting the colors, and one thing I found about wood is it is mostly red. So if you want to make it look like wood, leave quite a bit of red. So that's sort of the basic grain, and then this will be for the lines of the grain. I'll make this lower. And so that's sort of a basic wood look. And you can make it a lot of different types of wood, and so you can adjust the color and the grain structure to get different types of wood. I'll make it darker wood, maybe like a cherry. So that's my first wood. Now I'm going to make an oscillator wood. I'm going to start by adding a new equation. I'm going to copy this equation and paste it down here, and then remove the RGB from this one, turn off the alpha, and put it down here. And instead of T1, I'm going to put in a T2, and I'm going to change this from perlincubic to oscillator SC of V. And I'm going to just make my TF my final thing. So I'll just put in TF so I can look at that. And I'll change this to T2. So that's what that looks like, and so that's my wood pattern. If I zoom out a little bit and adjust the structure, goes like that. So it basically looks like that one, but as I stretch it out, it'll look a little bit more like wood. Now I'd sort of like to be able to rotate this wood structure around, but if I rotate this, it does that. What I want to do is rotate this pattern so it's at a diagonal like this, but then when I stretch it, it doesn't stretch that way, it stretches along the diagonal. So I'll see if I can do that. So I'm going to add another coordinate system, a variable, and I'll call it V2 because I'm working with texture T2. And this one is going to be a vec2, and I'm going to have a rotation in here, and I'll use another angle input for it. So it'll be v dot x times cosine of phi minus v dot y times sine of phi And then for the second part, it'll be v dot x times sine of phi and plus v dot y times cosine of phi. And over here, I'm going to change this to v2. Okay, and now I've got to add another angle input. I'll label that pH for phi, and this will be the grain angle. And so if I rotate this one, it looks like that. This one, it looks the same, but if I stretch this and I rotate this one, it does that, but if I rotate this one, it does that. And so I want it to look something, right, like that. That looks more like wood grain, or a basis for wood grain, if I leave it like that. In fact, I may shift it so it's like a little bit off like this. And so that's going to be my basic wood grain. So I'll just leave it at 45 degrees for now. And then the grains, you'll notice sometimes you can have dark centers or light centers depending on if it's even or odd. Now I want to add some turbulence to this, so I'm going to add in a couple of two different turbulence functions, and one of them will be a low frequency and the other one will be a high frequency. So I'll have a 0 to 1 range input for the low frequency and a real input for the low frequency, and a 0 to 1 and a real number for the high frequency. So this will be TR for turbulence, and this one will be turbulence scaling factor. So it'll be turb scale, and I'll just set that up to a couple. And then this will be turbulence H for high frequency. And then turbulence scale, turbulence scale H for turbulence scale high. Let's turn these down for now, and we'll bring them up later. So to my oscillator, I need to add on some turbulence. And I'm going to add TR times, I'm going to use directional noise and the S-curve variation of that, so S-curve directional noise, and then TS times V2. So now when I add my turbulence, it'll sort of warp the grains so they're a little more, not quite so uniform. I can change the frequency, but for this one I want it at a pretty low frequency, maybe 2 or 3. For the high frequency turbulence, I'm just going to copy this and paste it right next to it. So I'm adding on another one of these. I'll change this to, I'll add the letter H to both of these. But I'm going to multiply this one by 10, and I'm also going to divide outside of the parentheses by 10. So I want it 1/10 as big, but 10 times higher frequency, because I only want a little bit of this, and you can see it's adding in just a little bit of wiggle on the edges of the grain. So that's what I want. I'm going to bring the grains up a little more and then zoom in a little bit. And it's sort of uniform, but I'm going to change this so it's not quite at 45, and then I'm going to change this low frequency turbulence so it's not quite so obvious what's going on here. There. And then I can apply the same thing. So I'm going to copy my vector 3 stuff from up here, my color information, and replace it down here. So there's my second attempt at wood. This one is more uniform, or can be more uniform, depending on how much turbulence you have. So you could have it real uniform or distorted a little bit. With only two colors, it doesn't get that much depth, and wood, real wood, has a lot of depth to it. One way to add a little bit more to it would be to duplicate this, and then I'm going to take the difference of it. That's just black, but if I bring these down and make them sort of the opposite of what they were, in fact, I'm sort of enhancing the dark area, but I could bring these down a little further, so I'm de-accentuating it. Now what I want to do is, I don't want to mess with the scale, that'd be too significant of a change, but I could change the stretching just a little bit. Okay, you can see these highlights appearing here. And then I could change the turbulence a little bit. And you can get a little bit, I think a little bit richer color palette going by having this extra layer here. Now for my third pattern, I'm going to mix these two other patterns together using interpolation. So I'll start by copying this one, and then I'm going to bring in my variable T1 and plug it in, I guess, over here. And then I'm going to add a variable T3, because when I mix these together, I'm going to use a noise function, and in some regions I'll have my Perlin noise, and other ones I'll have the oscillator. And so I'll use the noise function to choose where I'm going to do each of those. So I'm going to create another variable T3, which will be the third texture, and this will be my interpolant. And that'll just be noisecubic of V, and I want to offset that so it doesn't align with the Perlin noise, so I'll add an A to it, because those are sort of the same. So to mix these, I'm going to use the sine interpolation, and I'll use T1, T2, and T3. You can see that some places it looks sort of like the oscillator, and some places it's more random like the Perlin noise. And I can increase the smoothness, and you can see, you can sort of see where the Perlin noise is and where the other is. Now I'd like to be able to control this a little bit. I'm going to add a 0 to 1 slider C, and this is going to mix. And in order to mix that, if I look at this, instead of T3, I could multiply it by C or add C to it, and the way I decided to do it was take the average of T3 and C. And so it will never go away, you'll never be at one or the other completely. If I move it this way, it's more Perlin noise. If I move it this way, it's more oscillator, and then halfway in between it's some of each. One other factor that adds quite a bit to this is adding bump map lighting on top of this, so I'm going to show how to do that. The bump lighting effect consists of 3 directional lights, one red, one green, and one blue. Diffuse is set to 0%, the specular is set to 100%, the shininess is set to 100%, and the ambient is set to 0%. The first light, the color is set to red, and the azimuth is set to 0 degrees, which is over to the right hand side, and elevation is set to 30 degrees. The green light, the azimuth is set to either minus 90 degrees or 90 degrees depending on the orientation of the y-axis. Since I usually have the y-axis pointing down, I'll set it to minus 90 degrees. The elevation is set to 30 degrees. The blue light is set to an azimuth of 0 degrees, which is right in the middle or shining directly at the surface from above. And so the elevation doesn't really matter. I'm just leaving it at 90 degrees. The texture can be set anywhere from maybe about 5 to as much as 15 pixels. If you get too high a number, artifacts start to show up in the texture. That can be adjusted later on by adjusting the opacity of the layer. The first thing I would do is to create another layer, another live filter, and add a lighting layer to this one. And I don't want it down inside the layer, I want it up above the layer like that. So the lighting that I want to set up is going to be bump lighting. So the first thing is set diffuse all the way down, specular and shiny all the way up, ambient all the way down, and then change this from a spot to directional light, and then this is 0, and this is red. So I'm going to change from HSL over to RGB so it'll be a little easier to dial in the red. So that's 100% red. And now the texture, I want it to be, I'll just set this to 15. And so there you can see the wood grain coming through. Now I need to add another light, and this one, these are all the same, so that's good. And I'm going to change it to a directional, and this is going to be minus 90. And the angle can still be 30, but the color is going to be green this time. And so it's already starting to look like a bump map. And then I'll add a third light, and that one is going to be directional, and this has to be at, this can be anything, but this will be at 90 this time, so it's right above. And the color for this one is 255 blue, like that. So that's my bump lighting. And now I'm going to add a live procedural texture filter and set up Phong lighting for this. I've got a previous video on Phong lighting, so if you want to just go to that one and use that, that's fine. But I'll just go over it here. Add an equation, set it to all 3 channels, and then I'm going to add in 3 sliders, and those are going to control the different types of light. The first one is going to be for the diffuse lighting, so I'll call it ID, and this is diffuse. The second one will be for the specular lighting, so the really shiny spots, so I'll call that IS, and this is the specular. And then the ambient lighting down here will be the last one, and that's just sort of this adding a constant value to the overall lighting, and that will be IA. To get started, I'll start with a variable. I'm going to create a normal map from this bump lighting, and so I take the normalized version of the debump of the R, G, and B channels. Those are the channels I just created with that lighting effect. The next part is to create the diffuse lighting from that. So to get the diffuse lighting from that, I take the dot product of the normal map, use dot product of that with the direction the light is coming from. So right now I don't have that, and so I'm going to add in 2 of these elevation rotation inputs. One of them is going to be the location of the light, the other one is going to be the location of your eye. So I'll call this the light, and this is the viewing angle. I guess I'll call it the view. And I need a parentheses right here. Okay, so there it's starting, you're starting to see it, and then I can move this around, and I'll just put it up on the upper left here, but that's the light position. Usually light is seen from above. All right, so that's my DL, and then I'm going to add in my specular lighting, which is variable SL. And what we do for this one is we take the power, so we're going to raise this to a power, and the higher the power is, the shinier it will appear. So I'm going to take the dot product of NM and the normalized of L, the lighting, plus the I. And then close off the normalized, and now I need to add a shininess factor for this. So I'm going to add a real input for shiny. I'll label it SH, and this is shininess. Let's call it shiny. And I'll bring this up, and you can see this is pure shininess now. Those specular points are going to get smaller and smaller as the shiny gets bigger and bigger. Now this is located here, but you can move this around, and usually if your eye is opposite the light, that's where you'll hit the maximum. So that's why we see it very shiny here. If we just want to catch some real specular highlights here, you can set it up to some place like that. So now I just have pure specular, and I want to mix these three together. So I'll do ID for diffuse lighting times DL, and then add on my IS times my specular lighting, and then add on the IA for the ambient. I don't multiply that by anything, it's just ambient light. And now I'm going to bring all of these down all the way, and then bring up just a little bit of diffuse lighting, and add in some specular lighting. And this is probably too, for wood, I don't really want it that shiny, so oops. I'm going to go down to about 7 or 8 there. And then if I want some ambient, I can add that on. So there's my lighting effect, and right now it's just gray, and it's based on, if I turn these off, it's based on this colored pattern right here, but it's converted it to grayscale. So I want this to be, I'm going to use the lighting effect in the mode up here. So I'm going to group these two together. So I'm going to group those two layers, and then go in, and if I go to hard light, you can see it's a pretty intense effect, and it looks very bumpy. I mean, you can really see the bump map effect in that one, but I want it to be a little more subtle, so I'm just going to go to overlay. You can turn that all the way off, and then just bring it up until I get the amount I want. And so I could leave it at like 50%. Just have a little, you can see that grain structure looks sort of 3D at this point. I've done a wide variety of different wood colors, and you can get, you know, cherry or oak or poplar or birch, plywood, all sorts of different types of wood grain and wood patterns that you can create with this method. Alright, so that's my wood grain structure pattern, and it's a very common procedural texture, pretty easy to implement. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.